Where the heck am I? Lost in the desert. 5 days without water and food. How long can I last in this landscape? Good afternoon, everybody. It's a hot, muggy July 9th afternoon, and I've just come out here to discuss a little bit about a project that I've been working on here for a few years now. And as gardeners, it's fun to experiment to see what you can make of an area, how you may be able to change or redirect an area that you're working on. Now, this was never a garden per se, but what it was when we first came here was a sandy hillside basically beside the driveway, and there were some non-native grasses growing in it, but it was very sparse, not dense at all, because a lot of this area had had its topsoil removed for the old sand pit that exists here. Anyhow, a number of years ago, I took it upon myself to try and recreate some habitat here. My thought was I'd like to create a bit of prairie, or a small area of what seems to be prairie habitat. That's why you can see a number of clumps of grass growing here. This is the Big Bluestem grass. It's a native grass to North America. Gets very tall with seed heads up over my height. And at some point a few years ago, I put in one of these guys. You've probably seen these, especially if you live in the United States, but even in Canada, they're quite common. This is what's referred to as Adam's needle or Spanish bayonet. The Latin name is Yucca filamentosa. The leaves produce long strand-like filaments along their edges, and these eventually peel off. This is the reason for the species name filamentosa. And these are a non-native plant to Ontario, but they are native to eastern North America. Once you get down into the United States a little ways, you start to come into the range of these plants, and they live all the way down to the Gulf Coast. They're more of a desert type plant, really, or a plant of arid areas, waste places, dry shorelines, things like that. But here in Canada, they are quite commonly seen because they're grown as a landscape plant. You can get them at nurseries. And they're very nice to have in your gardens if you have a garden large enough. As you can see, these are quite large plants, so they need quite a bit of space. Another characteristic that makes them extremely attractive for us here in Ontario, or southern Canada, is that they're cold hardy. They can live in areas that are rated as zone 4, which is basically equivalent to areas like Ottawa north of here and probably further north, even maybe up to North Bay, I'm not sure. But they do live and survive well in southern Ontario, even though we have very cold winters at times. For example, this winter was quite cold, and they're doing fine. But I really like them because they tend to give an area a bit more of that tropical feel or a desert-like feel. They're quite attractive, especially when they are in flowering state like this. They're actually a member of the asparagus family, and you can really tell that when you look at the flowering stems, especially before they've put the flowers out. They really look like a piece of asparagus. So as these plants mature, you can see the leafy sections get quite wide. They get up to about 2 or 3 feet high and 3 to 5 feet wide. This particular plant has a number of potentially stalk producing areas within it. And what happens is these plants go from a plant like I have on my right here, which is simply a single plant with a single flowering stalk, to a situation where they often put out side shoots and produce what are known as pups. This is what they call these younger plants that are on the side of the bigger, older plant. They call these pups. So the flowering stalk plant will die after it flowers. But if it has some of these pups, these ones will bloom in the following years. This plant, I don't see any pups on it yet, but it may get some later this year, or might get one, I don't know. So what you have essentially is a plant that looks like it's blooming maybe year after year or every other year, when in reality it's always a different plant that's blooming. And part of the reason for that is that because this stalk is growing fully just over the last month, puts a huge amount of energy into producing this stalk with all the flowers, and that drains the plant out basically. and it can't survive for another year. So that's how it produces, or that's why it produces some of these pups, to have another plant that's just like the first one. It's a clone of it, and it'll produce these flowering stalks well into the future. Just a better view of that single flowering plant with its single stalk. And here's a plant that has 4 pups, it looks like, growing off the sides of the original plant. And it's not going to bloom this year, probably because the center plant bloomed last year and has since died. Another example of a plant that has numerous pups, and 2 plants are blooming this year. So I've discussed how these plants produce asexually, that is by the production of pups on the sides of the original plants, but they can also produce sexually. And this is a plant known as a monoecious plant. By monoecious, I mean each flower has male and female parts. I guess what's most disheartening now is that I can no longer refer to these plants as I used to. Now knowing that each plant has male and female parts, when I used to think they were separated, now I can no longer look at a plant like this and say, wow, that's one big mother yucca. Some plants only have the male parts on one plant and the female parts on another plant. That's what's called dioecious. But these are monoecious, so they have male and female parts here. And given the right set of circumstances with the right fertilizing insect, and in this case it's usually a moth that's adapted to fertilizing this plant, given those circumstances, the moth being present and whatnot, then it simply goes into the flower and rubs against the male parts and then rubs against the female parts, and the fertilization takes place, and eventually the pods are produced, seeds produced, and then they can seed. And I have a number of seeded plants here as well. So it's interesting, just after 8 or 10 years or so, I've got about 10 large clumps of Yucca filamentosa, and these are mostly clumps with the pups on them. I have a few clumps that are just single plants. And then I've got probably as many seeded plants, whether it's a single plant or a group together, but they're not attached to one of these big clumps. So I'm assuming they've seeded themselves here. So it's interesting how they're getting around gradually over the years, expanding in this area. And they like this area because it's out in the full sun and it's a dry, droughty soil, sandy soil, and that's what they like. Now you can have a bit of gravel and stuff like that mixed in, but they don't want to be sitting in wet soil, and they don't want to be sitting in shade or even part shade for the most part. If you want them to grow and bloom well, you want them out in the full sun. So if you don't have any sun in your yard, I wouldn't recommend growing this or trying to grow it. But if you do have some sunny space in your garden, these plants provide a beautiful ornamental look to make that garden a more southern looking garden or a desert-like landscape. These would be great in a rock garden where you've got a lot of sedums, low-growing stuff maybe in between them, lots of rocks and gravelly soil, and then you have a few of these. That's the type of situation where these would really look nice, just accenting certain parts of a big rock garden. So here's a shot showing my butterfly weed mixed in with the Adam's needle. And I've also got lots of native milkweed growing through here to attract butterflies, monarch butterflies in particular.